tenemos entre nosotros a la Directora General Adjunta de la OMC, la señora Ángela P. Ellard. Ustedes ya han tenido su CV rodando en las redes. Ella va a tener la gran dicha de compartir con nosotros. Also, the panel will be shared with Professor Amrita Bahri from the WCP chair from Mexico, Professor Michel Levi from the WSTO chair in Ecuador, and finally, Professor Fernando Piérola, also senior counsel at the ACWL in Geneva, and he's representing the chair of Peru.
Buenos días. Es un gran placer estar aquí, but I will speak in English. That is the extent of my Spanish, unless I've had a pisco sour, then my Spanish gets better. But it is such a great pleasure to be here, to be part of this gathering in Lima, which is a city close to my heart. I've spent some time here over the years, both business and for pleasure. And of course, Lima is renowned for its vibrant culture, its storied historical past, and of course, its culinary delights. So I find it fitting that we are gathering here today to delve into the imperative of hosting and fostering inclusivity in trade, with a special focus on advancing women's economic empowerment. Peru, a country known for its resilient entrepreneurial spirit, boasts a remarkable statistic. According to some studies, over a third of its women are entrepreneurs. I would first like to thank Professor Sacco for bringing us all here together. The Chairs program is a key part of the WTO's commitment to capacity building for its members. I'm glad that we have chairs from other countries in the region here today, providing an excellent opportunity for knowledge sharing on today's topics, and this is really a highlight. Thank you very much. Allow me to begin with the premise that as the WTO is marking its 30th anniversary this year, our approach to international trade has transcended simply addressing economic efficiency, market access, and tariff reduction. Rather, we aspire for trade to serve as a catalyst for positive change, leveraging its influence to support those who have historically not fully benefited from the force of globalization, developing and least developed countries, small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as women, youth, and indigenous communities. This commitment aligns with our overarching goals of elevating living standards, promoting full employment, and fostering sustainable development as outlined in the preamble to the WTO Marrakesh Agreement, which is our founding document at the WTO. Making trade more inclusive by supporting the integration of these groups in international trade is at the forefront of our work at the WTO. That's why we've been promoting re-globalization to extend the benefits of international trade to more individuals and regions, ensuring that no one is left behind in the march towards economic prosperity and opportunity. Re-globalization is well underway, with companies expanding value chain investments in countries such as Vietnam, Morocco, and Costa Rica to maximize cost efficiencies, mitigate risks, and enhance market proximity. Now, the task is to extend this process to enable more countries, including in Latin America, to benefit from these opportunities. The WTO's main role in supporting re-globalization is in underpinning open and predictable international markets and reducing these trade costs through our rules, such as the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Let me elaborate on some of our work. First, our work on development embodies the WTO's commitment to ensuring that the benefits of global trade are shared equitably among all nations. At our most recent ministerial conference, MC13, held this past February in Abu Dhabi, our ministers made substantial progress in meeting the needs of developing and least developed members. Developing members widely regard MC13 as a success because WTO members secured several incremental yet significant advancements that eluded them for many years. First, ministers agreed by consensus, and we operate on a consensus basis in the WTO, to offer graduating least developed countries a seamless and sustainable transition period prior to the cessation of duty-free and quota-free market access following their graduation. At MC13, graduating LDCs were granted a 3-year transition period to avail themselves of LDC-specific technical assistance and to assimilate WTO rules into their frameworks. Furthermore, MC13 marked a watershed moment as ministers adopted the first decision in over 2 decades of negotiations concerning special and differential treatment for developing countries. Acknowledging the hurdles many developing nations encounter in complying with standards and technical regulations, members committed to delivering timely assistance to those countries during the implementation of such measures, thereby affording them the opportunity to actively shape these regulations. Beyond MC13, as part of its regular activities, the WTO has been instrumental in bolstering trade capacity in developing countries. Through strategic partnerships with various institutions, the WTO is actively engaged in assisting members in meeting international standards, enhancing trade facilitation measures, and fortifying trade institutions. The WTO's Aid for Trade initiative has been a catalyst for unlocking a staggering $687 billion in investment, empowering developing countries and LDCs to more fully participate in the global trade arena. I invite government representatives to participate in the upcoming 9th Global Review of Aid for Trade, scheduled for late June in Geneva, where we can collectively chart the course for inclusive and sustainable trade development. WTO members have also embarked on initiatives aimed at promoting women's economic empowerment and inclusion in international trade. As we know, neither the global economy nor trade is gender neutral. While women represent around 40% of the global workforce worldwide, their earnings are on average between 10 and 30% lower than those of men. Women also face higher obstacles than men in accessing the global market and the economic opportunities created by trade. As a result, globally, there are fewer female entrepreneurs than male ones, including Latin America and the Caribbean, where 43% of female entrepreneurs trade internationally. At the same time, international trade can be extremely beneficial for women. Data show that firms that export employ more women, pay them better, and offer better working conditions. In many cases, trade lifts women out of the far less advantageous informal workforce. This is especially important in Latin America and the Caribbean, where more than half of the economy is informal, which affects some 140 million people. Given the structural inequalities in global economy and commerce, rules governing international trade should be designed to ensure sustainable and inclusive growth, including by fostering the full and equal participation and leadership of women in the economy. This objective is at the heart of our work at the WTO in line with the mandate set in the Marrakesh Agreement. Let me outline some initiatives taken at the WTO to help address gender issues in trade policies. We had several positive developments in the area of trade and gender at our ministerial conference, MC13, in Abu Dhabi in February. First, at the multilateral level, our WTO ministers adopted by consensus a declaration that includes a paragraph recognizing that women's participation in trade contributes to economic growth and sustainable development. It also recognizes the work of the WTO on the topic, outlining capacity building and sharing experience as essential initiatives. This declaration is an important milestone in our work on gender equality. Second, at MC13, new disciplines on good regulatory practices for services trade entered into force. This agreement marks the first time that a WTO negotiated text contains a provision on non-discrimination between men and women in authorization processes, thereby improving prospects of women's participation in services trade. And we hope this will be a model for our future agreements. Third, a large group of WTO members launched the Compendium of Financial Inclusion Initiatives for Women-Led Small Businesses. It's an overview of measures adopted by WTO members to facilitate access to capital for women, aimed to assist policymakers in designing gender-responsive trade policies to enhance women entrepreneurs' financial inclusion. This initiative is meant to help close the whopping $300 billion in financing gap that exists for women-owned small businesses globally. Fourth, together with the International Trade Center, we launched a $50 million global fund called Women Exporters in the Digital Economy. This is for women exporters in the digital economy. Digitalization presents us with unprecedented opportunities to empower women entrepreneurs, as exemplified by the Connect Americas platform, which helped the number of female-owned businesses to surge since its creation in 2014. This new fund, which has received its first $5 million from the UAE, will help women-led businesses in developing economies and LDCs to adopt digital technologies and expand the online presence of their enterprises. There's nothing like money to make change. Going beyond MC13, as part of the WTO's regular activities, the Informal Working Group on Trade and Gender brings together 130 WTO members, including many Latin American countries. These members seek to increase women's participation in global trade through sharing best practices, applying a gender lens to the work of the WTO, and discussing how women may benefit from WTO initiatives such as Aid for Trade. I should also mention our WTO Gender Research Hub, launched in 2021 to improve the understanding of the impact of trade on women and gender equality. The hub serves as a knowledge-gathering platform where the latest research is shared. The hub includes trade and gender researchers and experts from the WTO Secretariat, 7 international organizations and regional organizations, 4 members of the WTO's chair program, Mexico, Chile, Barbados, and South Africa, and 8 universities. Of course, I would like to thank Professor Bahri and Professor Lopez as well for their contributions to the work of the Hub and academic scholarship on trade and gender that helps our WTO members to design better trade policies that promote women's inclusion. This work and these accomplishments at the WTO demonstrate a growing recognition that to achieve prosperous economies and well-functioning societies, we need to think not only about economic growth, but also who benefits from this growth and how. To conclude, let me reiterate that in today's ever-evolving landscape, trade remains an indispensable tool for building a more secure, inclusive, and sustainable world. Achieving prosperous economies and well-functioning societies requires a holistic approach that prioritizes inclusivity, equality, and sustainability. Events like today's are vital platforms for knowledge sharing and fostering dialogue among scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. By bringing together diverse perspectives, Chair's events facilitate the generation of innovative ideas and the formulation of evidence-based policies. Thanks to our Chair's research, policymakers can gain access to the latest data and the best practices, empowering them to make informed decisions and design more effective policies to address complex challenges. So once again, thank you all for attending and for bringing your valuable ideas to the table. All the work that you do back at home on these issues, all the discussions that you have among each other, and making the WTO a forum for having these discussions. I'm confident that by continuing to collaborate and innovate, we can build a future where the benefits of global trade are shared equitably by all. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you very much. Sometimes you know the figures, but now the way you put it, I feel more moved to do something from the chair. But I will not monopolize the the time, so we have so much. So let's start with innovative proposals and criticals. Please, Amrita, could you start?
Thank you so much. I think we should first give the floor to the men of the table when we talk about inclusive trade, isn't it? And so I think I propose that we could perhaps have more of a dialogue and use this opportunity to raise as many questions as we've always wanted to DDG Ellard, because I think for me personally, it's such a unique and golden opportunity to be able to have this dialogue with the DDG and get your views and guidance on where we can go and how we can go ahead on this debate and discussion, which is hard, which has a lot of complications, because we do face many barriers on the way of researching and publishing in this particular area from professional point of view. So if you don't mind, I would first give the floor to our chair from Ecuador, and then I can take up because I want to be the devil's advocate and probably present the critique, and it's not best to start.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I to be honest, for me, the first time that I was in contact with gender and trade was when I go first to Geneva to our first meeting of the chairs, the WCP the chairs, and well, I was wondering about why we haven't been involved in this kind of discussion before in my country, because I was talking with the people at the Vice Ministry of Trade, and they were not able to talk about the gender and trade. I think that the reason was maybe that we were involved more in trade negotiations, bilateral trade negotiations, and all kind of negotiations. But I realized that most of the negotiators in our side were women. So I was very happy to see that how gender was involved in all that kind of trade initiatives to spread, I mean, negotiations with other countries and multilateral negotiations. What I want to highlight is that this concept of re-globalization that you talk, more inclusive globalization, talking about the creation of more gender policies regarding involving women acting more in the field of in the different fields of trade is a kind of very interesting point for us. What I say is that what I want to say is that we don't know exactly what is the scope of this, what are the scope of these policies, and I would like to know more, because as I told you at the beginning of my speech, this is clear that we don't know exactly what's the role of gender in trade policies, and this is a problem for us. I feel this as a first impression of your speech. So it's fine like that. In the conversation,
Thank you. Well, I think the first step is always gathering the data. You know, that's the hardest thing, because sometimes the terms of trade are set in a way that it's very hard to be able to analyze based on gender. How many women are involved in trade? What type of trade is this? Are they involved at the kind of low-end manufacturing side, or are they entrepreneurs who are starting their own firms and who are able to export? So the very first step, I think, is to gather that information, and we've been trying to do that through the Trade Hub. The next step is to look at whether the rules of trade are established in a way that is gender neutral, or whether, you know, there are particular de facto outcomes, yes, that end up disadvantaging women, indigenous peoples, others, that make it harder to see globalization that benefits all. So we've done a lot of work in the WTO in cooperation with the chairs. You know, your work, of course, analyzing things like free trade agreements all over the world to see, is there a gender chapter? What does that chapter do? And just trying to increase the sensitivities. The domestic services regulation agreement, the plurilateral agreement that I mentioned that was finalized now at MC13, is our first agreement that actually contains a provision that requires this equal treatment. And that's the first we've seen of that in our agreements. And I think that it will be quite a model for the future. Something else that I would point to, and I think this is really where the chairs have such a tremendous impact, not just in setting the global rules, but setting the rules back home. You know, to the extent that you all are working with policymakers in your countries to show them the choices. Something very simple like tariffs. I think, you know, we've seen in many cases, developed and developing countries, that tariffs are higher for many products that women typically buy for their families, for themselves. And that type of bias in trade policy is really noteworthy, and it's probably not deliberate. It's kind of a function of protecting particular industries, let's say, that's led to this effect. I know we've seen it in the US, most definitely, and we could see it other places as well. So I think to answer your question, the first step is to gather data, because then that allows you to figure out where to make these policy choices. And now that we're in a time of re-globalization, of everyone critically looking at supply chains, there's a lot of movement going on now, and that makes this issue, I think, particularly timely to take advantage of as supply chains are being shifted around, to take advantage of this in the everyday, and especially now too, as we're moving towards trying to have more diverse supply chains with respect to green technologies. So I think it's all linked together. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much, DDG Ellard. Fernando, if you allow me, I will have a short comment and then pass you the word. I think I would want to start my comments by thanking you, DDG, for three things. First, for coming all the way to be with us, because I think we are, it's comparatively, it's a program where we are struggling to build capacity, and you being here with us gives us a lot of force and a lot of motivation to carry on the work that we have embarked on. Second, for being really the force of motivation and inspiration in the field of inclusive trade and sustainable development, because that gives us a lot of legitimacy, and not to us, but to our work and to what we are trying to do as trade lawyers. Because but we are often disqualified or labeled as non-mainstream trade lawyers, since we work in the areas of sustainability by our friends and colleagues. And third, for these very thought-provoking comments this morning, which reaffirm the importance of multilateralism for the field of trade and gender. And with that, I would want to make here sort of three observations, and then I have three questions, really quick questions for you, to help us chalk our road, our path ahead in the field of research. The developments and achievements you've mentioned in the field of trade and gender and inclusiveness, where different agreements have been arrived at the recent MC 13 to ensure that developing countries and least developed countries are taken along in this race for globalization are quite appreciable. However, there have been a few concerns in the academia regarding how more lately WTO has been sort of endorsing the concerns relating to women. Because if you look at the paragraph in the declaration of the ministerial conference that you mentioned, it comes with an acknowledgement, a recognition of the members, which in itself I think is a big achievement, because members have included that recognition by way of consensus, and that has never happened before in a declaration. It's a multilateral declaration agreed to by way of consensus. So I think when we talk about yesterday, we were having a dialogue on how consensus does not work, but it clearly could work here. But I think consensus has its own limits, because when we read the paragraph, it's a recognition, but it's far from being a commitment or a concrete promise as to what WTO members would do going forward. And it accompanies a footnote. And the footnote reads, as follows, that that the provision does not add to any rights or obligations of the WTO members. So they are not meant to take any step or even move a finger in this respect by way of adding this recognition in the document. So, and this is an example in a multilateral initiative, but we see very similar endeavors in bilateral trade and plurilateral trade agreements, where all, with very, very, very few exceptions, all provisions on trade and inclusiveness, be it a provision on trade in women, a provision on trade and disability, or a provision on trade and environment, they're all included or rooted in the spirit of cooperation. And most of the times, the parties clarify explicitly so in the agreement that these provisions that we are adding on sustainable development or inclusive development have nothing to do with the agreement's dispute settlement mechanism, making them completely non-enforceable. And oftentimes, in majority of the trade agreements, I've been working on this project for the last 3 years with ITC, with International Trade Center, as part of their She Trades Outlook, where we have looked at all 450 plus trade agreements. And we've seen that they have included commitments on inclusive trade and different concerns of inclusive trade without giving any thought on how they would be implemented, monitored, reviewed. So my concern is that these provisions sit there comfortably. Gerald and I were having a talk yesterday about how Canada-Costa Rica labor agreement has an enforceable binding provision on equal pay for equal work, but it sits comfortably in the agreement, and there has been absolutely no talks in the last 15 years to put it into action. So how do we ensure that they move beyond Cinderella promises? These provisions in the agreements, how do we make sure that they go to the next step? They're not just a tick in the box. And that brings me to my second comment here, regarding the nature of these provisions. So when we look at the content and when we read the provisions on women, disability inclusion, indigenous communities, and so on, where trade agreements and the parties are trying to make their trade agreements work for all, and especially for the vulnerable groups, a big concern comes out. And the concern is regarding the disconnect. The disconnect that has become visible over the last few years or decade between the barriers that these vulnerable communities face and the policy solutions provided by trade agreements or trade policies today. And I'll give you 2 examples here. One regarding women. In many developing countries that have gone ahead, such as Chile, Costa Rica, and Africa, AFCFTA, they've assumed plenty of commitments and provisions on women empowerment in their trade agreements. But they do not have a single provision on women's participation in informal economy. And more than 70% or a heavy majority of women in these economies, in these developing economies, work in the informal sector. So they have been completely left or ignored out of these sort of reforms. And my second example relates to disability inclusion. There are 27% of the trade agreements today that are vocal explicitly about disability inclusion. But when you look at the content of these provisions, none of them talk about waiving or relaxing the intellectual property rights protection of assistive devices, which has become a huge barrier for persons with disability, thanks to globalization and thanks to trade liberalization, which have strengthened the standards of intellectual property and the protection of intellectual property rights, that the prices of assistive devices in the world have gone up and their availability has decreased. And that has had a direct impact on the capability and lives or persons with disability. Where do we find the solutions from? We can look at the domestic policies and reforms, but of course, trade agreements have a tremendous role to play. Because they've had this impact, distributive impact, we can probably rectify this impact by the way we draft provisions on these concerns in the future. And that brings me to my sort of final comment about how can we move beyond just a tick in the box? Because we see when, and again, my question sort of limits to trade agreements. When we locate and we read these provisions on inclusive trade and even sustainable trade in the agreements, all we find are provisions that are included in the chapters on cooperation or preamble or the agreement's objective clauses or general statements or reaffirmations. And trade agreements have not included these important concerns on women, indigenous communities, disability, in the chapters that matter the most. TBT, SPS, agriculture, informal economy, digital trade, e-commerce, with very, very few exceptions, which we have seen in the last 3 years. We don't find these provisions in the agreements or in the places or chapters that are directly related to market access or trade. So my question for you, DDG, here is threefold. What role do you anticipate WTO members could have in this respect? In other words, what could be the kind of actions or activities going forward? Let's talk about the next 5 years. Could they assume to make some changes in this respect? Because I think we are now at a stage, we are facing sort of a deadlock right now, because we now understand, we have enough sort of knowledge in academia on how trade and gender relates. But how do we go ahead? How do we take this ahead? And I think we really need a push at the multilateral level, WTO being rightly positioned as a global rule setter, to move this ahead and to break the deadlock and the glass ceiling we are in right now. So what activities do you anticipate could we propose to WTO members from the chair's program going forward? And the other last question is, what could be the next few quick wins, so to say, at the WTO, at the organization, in this respect, to ensure that we take this discussion on inclusive trade beyond the world of promises, which so far, when we talk about trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, are not meant to be acted upon because they're drafted in such a manner. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Victor, because really, I'm so happy and excited to have this opportunity to hear you and your concerns on this, because I think it would really enrich our work going forward.
Well, thank you so much for laying out so many of these concerns and the frustration that you are justifiably feeling. I guess I would start answering your question by reflecting on what trade agreements looked like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, which was very focused on the benefit for large multinational corporations and the shareholders and leaders of those corporations. yes, with a nice side effect of creating jobs, which is real. I don't mean to diminish that. But that's how trade policy has been viewed, and in some ways still is being viewed, that it's driven by the corporate side of our economy and not by the worker side of the economy, let alone by all of the different communities that go into making up what the workers are. So looking back at that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, start to fast forward. What has happened in many what has happened in many trade agreements that we've seen, bilateral trade agreements, is starting, with mention in preambles of things like labor and environment, kind of best endeavor clauses, hortatory language about what government should do. Then, and I'm speaking in particular of my experience in the U.S. On trade agreements, where I spent many years as the chief trade counsel to the House of Representatives in Congress. Congress is the entity within the U.S. government that, under our Constitution, has the power on trade and gives authority to the administration, to USTR. So this was something that, I've really seen the evolution over the years on these issues. So trade and labor and environment, very heavily resisted by the kind of traditional trade interests. So it took a while to even get that language, hortatory language, to be put into trade agreements. Then as things moved, and as the US was considering trade promotion authority legislation, which sets the framework for trade agreements, what became the new consensus on trade was that these issues on labor and environment should be treated on par with trade, the traditional trade issues. So what that meant gradually is that they would be subject to dispute settlement. At first, it was dispute settlement light, but then it became the exact same dispute settlement. And so now in the modern era, so to speak, as we're looking at trade agreements over the last 10 years, not just in the US, but others as well, especially in this hemisphere, also with the EU, you see these chapters now becoming just as potent as the traditional trade ones. And if you look at the number of disputes under USMCA, you'll find that most of them relate to labor and the use of the rapid response mechanism to deal with union issues in Mexico. So I say that by way of example about how these things evolve. And the first thing is to kind of get your foot in the door, to have the acknowledgement in trade agreements. Maybe it's through a preamble, maybe it's through hortatory language, or through cooperation chapters. But then these things start to gain currency and traction. Cooperation is a good place to start, is a very good place to start. And I think we've all seen in trade agreements that sometimes that's really where the success of a trade agreement is, in the cooperation that is established among the parties as they meet once a year, let's say, and go through what have they achieved together. So don't lose hope that things starting slow, they really do ramp up. And so consider your work on disability. No one really had been considering that before, and you were the first to really put that on the table and to make people think about that. That's not just a gender issue. In fact, it's not, but it is an issue relating to how do we make trade benefit people who have not traditionally benefited from trade, or how do we address the particular barriers that they face? I think now we see at APEC, for example, an event tomorrow dedicated to these types of issues, in addition to the traditional discussion on trade. So APEC ministers from all over the world will be participating in this event on gender, including ministers, not just the traditional trade ministers, but ministers who have these issues within their portfolio. So I think that that's quite helpful. You're right that that we need to think of creative and meaningful ways to keep the pressure on, and we can't rest on our laurels. But at the same time, I think we have to bite off what we can and then use that as an opportunity to build. I think sometimes, well, sometimes people feel a little threatened by having these issues included in trade agreements or included in the discussion. And to demystify the issues, I think creates maybe an aha moment that we can take advantage of. I think we also should focus on issues that aren't traditionally known as gender issues, but how we make sure that trade does in fact benefit all. So let me give one example. The WTO's members, by consensus in 2022, agreed to the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement, which bans the worst form of fisheries subsidies, in particular IUU, with respect to IUU fishing. This agreement has tremendous benefit for two communities. One is fishers. And notice that I say fishers and not fishermen, because it's very clear when, as I've done a fair amount of traveling and going to fishing communities, that yes, quite often it's the men that go out on the boats, but the women are very much engaged in the in fishing and you know, dealing with the fish when they come back, cutting them, cleaning them, selling them, creating the whole nature of this very important sector. It is not. It definitely creates job opportunities for women too, and I was really amazed to see that. I didn't expect to see that, and I've seen it in so many countries now. So, and then the second group that the agreement benefits is those who eat fish and those whose livelihoods are dependent on having a steady and sustainable supply of fish. If we do nothing with respect to fisheries subsidies, we're going to find that the sustainability of fish, the health of fish stocks is going to continue to rapidly decline. So what can we do? Well, one area where we can, I think, become even more involved is how to enter this agreement into force. We need 110 of our WTO members to complete their domestic process to deposit the agreement into the WTO. Now, this is an agreement that everyone supports. It's just a question of going through the domestic procedures that should be non-controversial. We need 110 members for it to enter into force. We have 75. We have some from Latin America, but we don't have a lot, and we really could use more. And so this is something that does benefit women. It benefits families. It benefits sustainable fishing. It benefits livelihood fishing. Those who aren't necessarily part of the big industrial fishing complex, but artisanal fishing that so many communities depend on. So that's another example. That's an action item that I would suggest if the chairs could help us in getting movement forward for the deposit of these fish instruments. That could be a quick win. It's something that we're trying to do by the end of the year to get that last 36 members that we need. So the idea that I'm trying to push here is that trade benefits women. It benefits communities that have traditionally not been, that no one really has cared about when it comes to big trade policy. You know, if you're not a Fortune 500 company in the old days, you really had no voice. And now we see more and more indigenous communities who are benefiting from trade if we focus on the right types of trade. So Fish One, getting this agreement implemented, and then we're trying to conclude our Fish Two agreement that has even more disciplines. We're trying to conclude that within the next couple of months. So there's a lot of concrete action that I think that you could take. But my primary message is not to lose hope that sometimes progress is incremental because people are threatened. They feel threatened, rightly or wrongly. You have to kind of bring them along. And then suddenly they become true believers.
Thank you so much, DDG Ellard. Fernando, would you like to have the word?
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon or good evening to those who have joined us online. It is truly a pleasure for me to be with you today. Here I'm sitting at one of the rooms which I used to be in when I was a student at this university, but I was sitting on the other side. I was never sitting here, so it is really a privilege this time. And I think it is a higher privilege to share this panel with DDG Ellard, with Amrita and with Michel today, and to talk about this topic of such a great importance in today's trading agenda. The question of trade and inclusiveness or inclusivity. And I think, perhaps I would like to make, some specific remarks concerning the question of gender and trade, but I would also like to expand perhaps my thoughts a little bit more broadly to talk about some other communities that, are not, let's say, benefiting from, the big advantages that international trade or the international trading system provides. I think, international trade for countries like ours, like Latin American economies, countries like Peru, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and the other countries in the region is, quite critical to ensure the quality of opportunities for women, for indigenous groups, for communities that are somehow marginalized, for one specific fact, that when a company gets into international trade, it has to become formal. And formality means a lot, because formality means that, whoever is employed gets a real salary, the salary that is, given in accordance with the domestic law. You benefit from labor conditions, and you have to be formal, of course, for several reasons: fiscal reasons, money laundering regulations, banking regulations. A company cannot get engaged into international trade unless it is a formal company. So suddenly, trade is a friend. Trade is a tool that helps ensuring equality of opportunities for women and for some communities that have not been beneficiaries of the trading system more generally. And I think in this sense, it seems to me that the key is how to integrate those communities into the international, scheme of things. And I guess there are many efforts that have been carried out. I think many of them are at the multilateral level. Some others are at the regional level sometimes. And of course, there are some national policies that have been undertaken that I think should encourage further. I think at the multilateral level, DDGLR was talking about the agreement on trade facilitation. I think that's something that has been very beneficial for those groups that didn't have the resources to access, a global market and to integrate into a global value chain. We also have some other discussions, on an agreement on investment facilitation for development. And I put emphasis here on the word development because, one of the benefits of this agreement or this regulatory framework is to create an environment, an investment climate that would facilitate, the integration of those players that are otherwise marginalized. And I think there is also something else that I think is mostly an economic / technological development that I think it plays, to the advantage of communities that have not benefited from trade, which is the progress of the digital economy. And I think, we have with COVID, for example, we have experienced a situation in which, given the fact that, of course, suppliers and consumers of services could not share, the presence, the same place, remote access became of critical importance. And digitally delivered services have become one of the fastest growing areas in international trade. And certainly, there is a huge potential for these communities, that they can extract, from the expansion of the digital economy. Certainly, is one of those areas where I think developing countries can reveal their comparative advantage we know that under mode 4 in services, the movement of natural persons, sometimes, there are impediments to cross one border because, several reasons, visas, residence permits, and so on and so forth. But with digital tools, service providers located in one jurisdiction can provide their services to another market without facing any of those constraints. So I think there are certainly, many obstacles that we're facing. Some of them are of a regulatory character, some other are, cultural stereotypes. And I think there is quite a room here for taking advantage of opportunities. I think the key, in my perspective, is the notion of integration, that the communities have to reach, the global value chain, the international trading flows, the international trading communities. And of course, integration is a notion that is quite close to inclusivity. Certainly is something that it has been somehow there. I think DDGLR, when she started her speech, she was talking about the GATT 1947, the preamble, talking about, raising living standards, calling for job creation, the use of resources, and so on and so forth, which in a way, calls for, let's say, the consideration of development, more broadly speaking. But in fact, if we look at how this has been materialized in practice, well, we know that there are certain provisions on special differential treatment contained in the WTO agreements. There have been always, quite a good deal of debate as to whether, they are just in hortatory language or they are binding, they create real opportunities, no? And certainly there is a fact that, many people have gotten extremely rich out of the trading system, whereas some others have not attained, the same type of situation. And then I think the question that comes now is, what do we do? How do we make trade, work effectively for everyone? I think certainly, there is scope for the rules, the regulatory process. I think DDGLR was talking about the reference paper on domestic regulations, which is, I think, something that we should highlight because, in fact, it makes it very clear that when, engaging the services of a supplier, discrimination shouldn't be made based on gender. Certainly, that's a regulatory approach that I think should be considered seriously, for some other regulatory efforts, in the WTO negotiating scheme. I think these are the comments that I have for now at this stage. Thank you very much.
Should I comment on that? Okay. Thank you for that. And the key word that you used of integration, I think is so very important because you need to have that. You need to have that integration in order for communities to benefit. And by communities, I mean whether traditional communities or communities of women, LGBTQ, whether it's communities related to disability, indigenous communities. It is all a question of integration. And the beauty of trade is that trade is the ultimate integrator. But making sure that there's a transition to a more formalized economy as opposed to taking advantage of communities is so important. You highlighted several of the pieces of work that the WTO has done that have been the most successful in this regard, or which have the prospect of becoming the most successful. So the Trade Facilitation Agreement is one of those beautiful agreements that's not about a zero-sum game of making a concession to get somebody to make a concession to you. The Trade Facilitation Agreement is all about how do I make myself a more attractive partner, making it easy to trade with me, either for others to export to my country or for me to export to them. It's a win-win for everyone, and we've certainly seen how so many have benefited from the cost of trade, just the cost of doing business having been reduced. It has so much of a more tangible benefit even than in many cases than reducing tariffs. So it's very important from that perspective, eliminating red tape, eliminating corruption, making sure that goods move smoothly at the border. The Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, now which has been reached, and we're trying to figure out how to integrate this plurilateral agreement into the WTO infrastructure. This is using TFA as the model, but instead for investment for development. And it is noteworthy that out of our 160 members, more than 120 of our members are part of that, and it's seen as an agreement that will benefit developing members because it creates opportunities for sustainable investment, and that benefits all communities, including marginalized communities. Let's face it, the big companies, they don't really need that. The developed members, they don't really need that. They already have it. But it's the small and medium-sized businesses who will see this the most. And then, of course, you mentioned the digital economy and our work on digital trade in the WTO, on e-commerce, whether it is the plurilateral initiative or whether it is on the question of whether the moratorium on a collection of customs duties on e-commerce should, on digital transmissions should continue, coupled with a work program to help developing economies take advantage of digital trade. And when you see this, and we've certainly seen this, I think even highlighted during the pandemic, the communities that really benefit from digital trade are communities that have been marginalized and that haven't been out there in the sectors, in the trading world before. So it makes it easier for women to participate in the economy. It makes it easier for other communities that may be rather far-flung, indigenous communities that may not be mainstreamed. All of a sudden, with a cell phone, you can do an awful lot of business that you haven't been able to do before. So these three aspects that you so rightly focus on are the things within the WTO that I really see as changing the nature of trade, to moving us away from big company, corporate interest-driven trade to something that is more integrated into the economies all around by touching small and medium-sized businesses and those who haven't participated in trade before. And that, creates, I think, tremendous opportunities, not just in trade, but downstream for these communities as well, for reducing poverty, for increasing food security, and participation in supply chains. So thank you for raising those points.
Thank you so much, DTG Ellard. Victor, should we get some questions, or should we wrap up?
So happy that we're time. Now we have maybe have some questions from the other chairs.
Sure, yes. That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, TDG, for all and all the panel. I would like to add maybe three things about this. About fisheries, I have a good news. In the case of Costa Rica, it's already at the Congress, so we are just waiting for the approval. So maybe sooner than later we're going to have it, because obviously for political reasons now we are changing all the directory of the Congress, but it's already for being approval. And the second one, it's about the digital trade gap in Central America. For example, we are researching about that, and we are wondering how to do things differently. For example, when you are building skills or capabilities of women who are involved in exports, for example, all the workshop is in the morning or at 3 or 5 p.m., but at that time, they all have all duties. For example, the kids will take care of the grandparents. So we have to start the workshop at 10 p.m., for example. So you have to do different things when you are working with these realities. And I think each country has their own. And that's the huge challenge that we have, how to implement all this. For example, Chile has a gender chapter in so many free trade agreement. We already start with Ecuador. Is the first free trade agreement that Costa Rica has a gender chapter into it. This in the Congress as well for the approval. But how to start evaluating how this chapter and all these things exactly benefit for the different women and the different groups that they are into. And the other thing that you mentioned, it's about the supply chain. I think in Central America or countries like Costa Rica, we have a lot of women in the informal area. How to get them into the formal and how to get them into the supply chain trade. I mean, thank you so much for this opportunity to hear you, because it was really interesting, and we have a lot of work to do in our country to move forward with this topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the good news about the fish agreement being now in Congress in Costa Rica. Hopefully that will move along quickly. You never know with Congress all over the world. Having worked for one for many years, I know that they can be unpredictable, but when they act, it means something. And I hope that others in the region will push on this as well. I note that we have a fund, a fisheries fund, that is designed to help developing members it helps developing members implement the terms of the fish subsidies agreement and establish good fisheries management programs. That fund is available only to members that have implemented the agreement. So that creates a little positive incentive, I think, for members to go ahead and do that. You raised very good points about the digital trade gap that has occurred, and the need to be sensitive that even when digital trade or trading in a digital means, even holding meetings and training programs, that while doing these things remotely, is easier now than before. We still have to be conscious of the time and making it easy to use for those communities we're seeking to that we're aiming for. So that's a very important point. And then finally on supply chains, as to your point on supply chains, that's what it's all about really, because very few countries and very few companies can manufacture absolutely everything domestically. You need to be part of a supply chain, whether it's part of the initial, in the case of goods, pieces that go into parts that go into, semi-finished goods that go into finished goods. At some point, being on that supply chain is very important. And creating through the trade facilitation agreement, through the investment facilitation for development agreement, these are all development-oriented tools that make small and medium-sized businesses, as well as large companies in developing countries, more attractive partners for supply chains. And as some of the big players are looking to diversify their supply chains, I think it's really important, for the United States to look at its neighbors as the best candidates for being in these supply chains. But it's important not to just wait for that to happen, but to affirmatively try to make that happen. So thank you for your comments. Appreciate that.
Okay. Thank you so much, GDG. I just wanted to, before Victor, you wrap up the panel, I'm sure we all have sort of gathered a lot of new thoughts and ideas to take back home from this panel. But I would say that I would go back home with 3 additions to my way of thinking about this from the intervention of our DDG. First, really important message that came out from your speech and comments, DDG, for me was that we cannot lose hope. I think yesterday we were talking a lot, and we have another panel this afternoon on trade and gender, where we'll probably explore the problems that we are dealing with right now, and precisely the concerns that you touched upon as to how it's very difficult for countries to assume commitments, binding commitments in this respect, because of the fears of protectionism, comparative advantage, cultural imperialism, and whatnot. So there are big fight with big barriers ahead of us, but we need to keep up the work, and we need to keep up the hope. And second, take-home message for me is that we need to focus on what we have achieved. Fisheries agreement is such an important policy instrument. And in the region, we need to now focus on how we can go about ratifying this agreement on our lands. And third, really important sort of contribution is about the terminology you used regarding new consensus. I think that's a big step forward. We have a new consensus on social issues in the trade arena, and especially at the WTO. So I think it's now in our hands to leverage that further, but we already have the foundation. Once again, thank you so much, DDG, and without further ado, I would like to give the word to.
I'm sorry for this, but could you ask you something? Because I know the students are on exams, and some of them, especially women, have taken the time, despite that they have to study, to come. And one of them have took the courage to make a question. I don't know if we can accept it. Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Victor, and everybody that is making this possible. I'm very happy to see that a little part of WTO coming here at home because it's an institution very close to my heart, and I'm very happy to see very familiar faces here. Well, a bit of my background. I'm Jomaine. I used to work as an international trade lawyer, but now I'm entrepreneur in the wellness and health industry. And in that sense, I want to share and kind of reassure the opinions and the comments that has been said about the digital economy, about the power of women, because now from reality, I can see that because we have to bear into account that one thing is reality and usually reality comes before the policy making, right? Usually policy making should adjust to reality. And something that I'm seeing is that women are becoming like a driving force in digital economy and mainly in this wellness industry. Because just as you said, like now we have the women that come from developing countries, least developed countries. Thanks to the internet, we have the power to reach other consumers, to reach other markets. And now we don't need to use like the goods, right? We can make like the digital products. And I have seen in my experience and around in Latin America, this has been very, very helpful for women because they are like creating these products to share their experiences, their journeys, and mainly related to wellness, related to mental health, related to physical health, to satisfaction, life satisfaction. And actually they are making like a good money with that. So something it's for me it has been like a different reality that before I didn't know it was possible, and I'm very happy that actually these women can take these advantages, right? So and in this new game, I think that the three main pillars or factors are the digital economy, social media, and the wellness industry. So I think that those three would be like the driving motivators or factors for a huge transformation that it's now happening and that is going to get stronger in the future. So I really would like to to keep encouraging the work that WTO and ITC are doing in that regard, digital economy, teaching, right? As you say, teaching the women how to use these tools, because they are there, they are available, but sometimes it's not that easy, right? So all the training in that regard would be very, very, very helpful. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So I think, but puede ser muy directa y rápida, sí. I just asking to be direct and fast because of the time.
Yeah. First of all, good morning with everyone. I will first say thank you all for the valuable information. I think for many years, as you said, women has been not properly recognized for their work in many areas in society generally, and also in business because this was presented for a long time as an exclusive area for men, regardless the participation of women. So with that being said, um, I consider that these steps are not just a huge first one, but an inspiration for more changes in general as well. My question, do you think this trade policy about gender inclusion in all of that could be spread to the other countries that are not part of the MIC? OMC? Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for taking the time to come here today. I know it's a busy time of year with exams. I do think that there are lots of ways to try to leverage the success and to try to encourage success more broadly. I think that one of the beauties of the Chairs program is that it brings together so many different experiences within a region, but even more broadly, to share ideas and the experiences that you may see in one country and the success stories that have come from that, and how to translate that into somewhere else. I could see a lot of cross-pollination in terms of the discussion. I think that's important for policymakers, it's important for academics, and it's also important for business. Even small and medium-sized business, micro businesses, to develop these networks to try to engage. And that's the beauty of digital trade, and the beauty of trade itself is that it creates these opportunities for cross-pollination. So I think that at the same time, our policymakers need to be sure that the rules of the road are established in a way that facilitates this type of trade. And we do a lot of work within the WTO through our technical assistance and capacity building policies. You know, the work program on digital on e-commerce to help members take advantage of e-commerce to eliminate, minimize the digital divide. Those are tremendous opportunities as well. So we try to create that forum. A couple of things that I would mention, I know we only have a moment, is that the WTO is hosting a public forum. We call it the Public Forum in September. And I definitely encourage you to register, to set up programs. The topic is inclusivity, trade and inclusivity. So it's very much related to the things that we've been talking about, and we're trying to get a diverse set of panelists, sessions that can be very specialized. So the opportunity now is to register a program to share experiences, and we really do want to see not just the usual people who come, but people who come with fresh ideas and bring others with them. So I do want to mention that. But perhaps I should just conclude by thanking you, Professor, and thanking all of you for hosting me today. My colleague Irina Polovets, who is just such a vital part of this work as well in Geneva. And to thank you for this tremendous opportunity. It's very exciting discussion, and it warms me up for a discussion that we're going to have tomorrow in Arequipa at the ministerial level on very much these same topics. And then in the afternoon, we have our regular trade policy session. And of course, I should also thank the contributors to the chairs program, who without whose support we wouldn't be able to have a program like this. So in particular, France, Korea, Australia, Austria, who've been enormous supporters. So thank you very much for this opportunity. It really is exciting and encouraging, and it just makes me think new, fresh thoughts. So thank you for that.